tomorrow, so I trust everyone is well prepared for that. Olivia is calling the shots on how that goes, but it will be similar to previous years where we'll have 25 stations where we rotate around 2 questions per station and 2 minutes per station. Okay? As far as spelling goes, do the best you can. Again, Olivia will be grading these. She is the freedom to sort of make some judgment calls. Hopefully, the spelling is reasonable. Okay, so I know some of these names are sort of long and resemble tongue twisters. Well, last time we were talking about the different ways in which fishes move, including the ways in which the fins are used for locomotion. And remember, you sort of have these 2 broad ways in which different movements can occur. Namely, you can have, clearly if different structures are used, you have different types of movement. But the same structures can be used in a variety of different ways, which also results in different ways of movement. And we see a lot of that popping up with how the different fins of fishes are used. And some fishes propel themselves using a combination of the pectoral and pelvic fins. Of course, these are the paired fins. And one way in which this happens, and this is indeed rather unusual, but it's kind of interesting, is simply walking along the bottom. Okay? And a great example of that can be found in a whole bunch of these fishes collectively known as anglerfishes or frogfishes and so on. I think it's kind of cute because there's a bigger one and a lower one behind it. Obviously, when you look at the shape of this fish, well, maybe not so obvious. Are these fish streamlined or not? No. Arguably, they're not. So streamlined shapes tend to look like airfoils, okay? A thin leading edge and a thin trailing edge. And these almost look like fuzzy footballs. Well, not even as good as a football. There you can see why they're called anglerfish, because they have these various lures that attract other fish. They're very powerful suction feeders. Okay. So this is clearly a very derived locomotor behavior found in this group. Okay. Where's the fish?
The not cut, like oddly colored part.
Yeah. So a nice example of cryptic shape and coloration. Again, not exactly an anatomy that would appear to be well suited for rapid locomotion. But on occasion, this species of fish does something very, very odd, and let's see if you can figure out the unique mechanism of propulsion occasionally used by these guys. Oops. Should advance that a little bit too.
Which side is the front?
This is, and it's sort of hard to tell, isn't it? The resolution's not great, but you can see the mouth there, okay? And the eyes right there. What's it doing?
Skipping.
Pardon me?
It's like skipping this. Skipping. Like skipping on its fins. It's like hopping up and down.
What else?
Is it using water to push it through?
In what way is it using water? Okay, it's one of the most peculiar things that fishes do is actually use water and the feeding and ventilatory apparatus for jet propulsion. Okay, so this is not an example of fin locomotion, but as long as I had the videos up of these angler fishes, I thought I'd show you something that's even odder still, rather than using the pectoral and pelvic fins to walk along the bottom. In some cases, the paired fins can be used to walk, but not on the bottom and in the water, but in fact out of the water. And a great example of this are the mud skippers. Those are within the family Gobiidae. An awful lot of them are in Southeast Asia, although they're not exclusively in Southeast Asia. No, that's not a mud skipper.
Is that also like a lungfish? Or really closely related to a lungfish?
It is not at all closely related to a lungfish. It does not have anything resembling a lung. Periodically, it moistens the gills, and as long as there's a water film over the gills, it's good to go.
So what's made this upheaval?
That's not a fish, I hope you realize. Here comes the fish.
Lies in the mud.
So this particular species is a fairly large one, maybe about 6 inches long or so.
It exposes mud flats. Sunlight hits the rich silk, and tiny plants and animals flourish there. All food for a mudskipper.
And notice the close proximity of the pelvic and pectoral fins.
It's hard work to find the base.
What's the clade for which that's a synapomorphy? Hermaphroditism.
Jumping high above the mud will get you noticed.
And a whole lot of the relatives of mud skippers
Eyes perched on the
actually do various amounts of jumping for both courtship and territorial displays.
And males fight those who intrude on them.
So here you can see some function of fins that actually has nothing to do with locomotion, but is involved in a territorial dispute.
Increased fish.
But notice how they're, when they're chasing each other, how they're using their fins. How are they using those fins? Okay, so I see some very good imitations with arms, but if they're going like this, we refer to that as something lateral. What's the prefix? Bilateral fin movements. In other words, simultaneous movements of left and right side fins. Okay? And most of the propulsion actually occurs from the pectoral fins, whereas the pelvic fins largely sort of help prevent slipping and pop the body up. Okay? And then here's the coelacanth. This is not a lungfish, although it belongs to the subclass Sarcopterygia. So it is a lobed fin fish, but not a lungfish. It's a deep sea fish. It was thought to be extinct for a long time. And as it turns out, if you go in the right areas, they're actually not all that uncommon, as was once believed. But because they're found in such deep waters, there's still a lot of things about them we don't know. How is that or similar or different to how the mud skipper was using its pair of fins?
It's
Somebody in that back corner, back left corner. How are the fins being moved?
One after the next.
Can you use a term similar to the term we used for mud skipper movements? How did the mud skipper use its pectoral fins? Bilaterally? Yeah. Alternating unilateral movements of the fin. And on top of that, the coordination of the pectoral and pelvic fins is such that they're out of phase with each other. So you have left front and right hind being moved at the same time. That's referred to as a diagonal couplet, okay? So that's also very different from what we see in the mud skipper, okay? So even though this is not an amphibious fish, as we will discuss in more detail when we deal with the the water to land transition in amphibians, an ancestral gait of winged vertebrates involves diagonal couplets, where within a girdle you have these alternating unilateral movements of the appendages, okay? And interestingly enough, we see that in a deep sea lobed-fin fish, the coelacanth. That's isn't it just a gnarly looking fish? I mean, all these specimens, they just really seem very odd. Okay, besides allowing fish to go from A to B, some of the other important things that fins do is they may be involved in maneuver and stopping. Let's think a little bit. What are sort of two fundamentally different ways that a fish could stop?
It could like make itself not as streamlined to like create more drag, which would like slow it down.
Okay, so creating more drag, absolutely right. What's another way?
Reversing the direction of the fin, so instead of pushing forward, it's pushing backwards.
In many respects, that's involved in enhancing drag, okay. But in fact, the fins could be moved vigorously enough that rather than just sticking out and passively creating drag, in theory, the fins could actually be moved forward, which would create a force to reverse the fish. What's another way? When you're driving your car, think of driving your car and coming to a stop.
You could just slow down until you're not moving anymore.
Yeah, if you simply cease to generate thrust, that's yet another thing, because you're in a medium that has drag, so ultimately drag will have you come to a stop, even if you're as streamlined as possible, okay? So you can sort of take your foot off the gas, it's kind of one mechanism, or you can apply the brakes. Sort of think of it as that way, yes.
Is there ever instances where fish move like their tails to one side, only one side really sharply, like
The gills?
no, like their caudal fin, like if they were to just take their tail just like one side very sharply to kind of just stop their forward movement? That ever?
That's a darn good question. Let's see. I didn't pay you to ask that question, I promise. I want everyone to look at this video of a bluegill during suction feeding. And in fact, the fish comes to a standstill. And I want you to closely look at structures that are relevant for attaining that end. So make a little list of things you see here that are involved in what is actually a rather generalized method of coming to a rapid stop. I think one of the things that really impresses me, in fact, about fishes is their ability to come to a stop really fast. It's so easy to get focused on what makes fish go. So you have your, how many things do you have in your little list? What's going on? You jotted some ideas down? Somebody in the factory world, what's one thing that's happening when a bluegill stops?
These pectoral fins are outstretched.
Okay. And in this row, can you kind of elaborate on what the pectoral fins are doing? So they are outstretched. And are they just held like this? Okay. And a forward movement is referred to as protraction. Okay. In this row, remember a key thing for paired structures is unilateral or bilateral. What do we see for pectoral fin protraction? Bilateral pectoral fin protraction. Can you add to our list of what's going on with how this little bugger stops?
Caudal fin, kind of.
In what direction?
Bilateral.
Okay, that's a little tricky because of the two lobes of the caudal fin. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Are you talking about this? Are you talking about enhancing the surface area?
Like on the bottom, yeah, the surface area is enhanced. It kind of, like, at first it was.
More like this?
Yeah.
Well, we have to keep track of sort of surface area versus orientation of the fin. What about for you to What about the orientation of the caudal fin?
Um,
So it's expanded.
It was expanded horizontally. Slightly.
Okay, that's, when I think of expansion, I think of increasing the depth of the caudal fin. Okay, perhaps I'm not being very clear in my descriptors. So it's a different movement if it's moved laterally. Okay. So in fact, it is moved laterally. And can you tell me if it is moved laterally, is that going to facilitate stopping? Yes or no? If it's curled, so we got a yes. Now in this row, why?
Because you're generating, like, you're pushing against the media and it's going to push back on you. So
Yes, in part. And in this row, if it's simply held like this,
Increasing drag.
bingo. There we come back to, using drag as a braking mechanism. Okay, can you add to our list of what's going on here?
It looks like all the fins start to just stop generating force.
Actually, in a lot of herpomorphs, you rarely see the pelvic fins being used to propel the fish. They do have an important role in maneuvering and stopping. And what are those pelvic fins doing? And if they stick out, they're doing what? Adding to drag, okay? So the pectoral fins are bilaterally adducted to increase drag. And in this row, can you add yet more to our list?
I don't know if it's similar to what you said the caudal fin was doing, but like it looks like the pectoral fins, like in addition to abducting, it looks like they're splaying out more to.
Indeed, their surface area is nearly maximized. Can you add to our list? It takes a bit of a sharp eye for this last thing. What are some fins we've not yet mentioned? They're all experts on fish fins from everything we've seen in lab, right? What about it? It is, indeed. And can you add to that? What else is going on there?
Increase the surface area, would also increase drag, slow down.
How's it increasing drag? Well, surface area by itself indeed increases drag some, but there's yet another important thing that's happening. Can you fill us in on that? By doing what? When you look at the shape. Okay, well again, that's just increasing surface area. What about orientation of the medial fins there? They're curled. Okay? They're sticking out from the sides of the body. Okay? So I think this is an exquisite example of how in some cases, basically everything the fish can use, it's using to slam on the brakes. And although it doesn't show up quite so well in this particular sequence, for a very rapid stop, you generally see the caudal fin flexed to one side and the opposite side of the anal and dorsal fins, so that those lateral forces balance out and the fish doesn't make a turn when it comes to a stop. So if the fish wants to keep going straight and just come to a dead stop, it's very important that any lateral forces cancel each other out. Okay, very good. Again, we keep relating structure to function. Okay? And there's some oddball things that happen for the locomotion of fishes. Some of you may be aware of a walking catfish that sadly is one of many non-native and invasive species in South Florida. They're very nasty predators, not terribly selective, so they're quite worrisome from an ecological point of view. And there's the fish out of water, moving, but moving by a different mechanism than the mud skipper. What's going on here?
It's using its tail to kind of create force to jump forward.
In part, yes. What else?
It's also putting its pectoral fin down to like create drag on the ground.
Yeah, it's actually, there's spines in those pectoral fins, and it's using that to sort of make an anchor point, if you will. Okay? So we do not see anything resembling a bilateral retraction. Instead, those pectoral fins, along with their spines, pretty much go out to the side, and then flexing the body and kind of rocking the body a little bit, they ultimately engage in the ground surface. Okay, so, whether or not walking is an apt descriptor of that or not, I think one could debate. I don't know if you're aware that some eels, in particular freshwater eels in the genus Anguilla, can make overland excursions. Here's the tracks of one left behind in the mud. And they can travel considerable distances. Here's one moving on grass. Okay. Why we have those sound effects, I have no idea. Eels do not make those noises when they fall. Okay. But there we see alternate bending to the left and the right. There are waves that are propagated from head to tail. Those push against things that stick up in the environment, and the eel gets propulsive forces, reactive forces that are generated forward. Hopefully while all of those lateral forces cancel each other out. Okay? So much for how fishies move. The birds gotta fly, the fish gotta swim, and all that stuff. For the remainder of this unit, we're going to cover not the birds and the bees, but maybe the birds and the bees of how fishes reproduce. It would be wonderful to have a whole course on the reproduction of fishes. Perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising, given that there are over 25,000 extant species of fishes, that there's a lot of diversity for how they reproduce. So we're barely going to scratch the surface. I freely acknowledge I'm painting with some very broad brush strokes to certainly keep that in mind for some of these punchlines that I offer. A good way of organizing this material is to compare and contrast with certain examples, okay, with respect to how male and female anatomy may differ. Again, at the level we're going over in lecture and is on the handouts. How is sex determined? Actually, that's pretty doggone complicated. What are the modes of reproduction? And what are the reproductive guilds? Again, you've got a lot of this material for reproductive guilds on your handout. We'll go through some examples in lecture, and you should be able to provide at least one example for each reproductive guild. Okay? So reproductive guilds encompass more than the modes of reproduction. This is sort of dealing with the physiology of reproduction, but the reproductive guilds not only deal with these modes of reproduction, but what's going on with respect to where eggs are deposited, whether there's parental care, and so on. Okay? And hopefully you realize that there are often trade-offs in reproduction of animals. So they're very important life history trade-offs. And a recurrent theme we'll be dealing with here in all classes of vertebrates when it comes to reproduction is you produce a whole bunch of young and invest very little and have very large numbers of young. Or you have a reduced number of young and have a large investment in each and every individual that's reproduced. So realize there are some species of vertebrates in a reproductive bout that only have a single offspring. We're a good example of that, okay? There are other vertebrates that may actually have tens of thousands of young. Those are really profound differences. Very different strategies with very different consequences, okay? Well, again, if we paint with some rather broad brush strokes, most species of fishes are kind of boring in that they have either individuals that are either male or female, and they are that sex for their entire life, so-called monochoristic sex determination. We're rather used to that, okay? And you're probably aware in our species, males have an XY chromosome and females have an XX. And again, painting with very broad brush strokes is usually the males in fishes that are the heterogamitic sex. But with almost every generalization I make, there are some exceptions. A very noteworthy exception of this are the ocelids. Okay, that includes the guppies, mollies, and clades, where that's actually not the case. Okay. Things get very complicated because early on in the development of fishes, the gonads are not differentiated into male and female gonads. Compared to other groups of vertebrates, this happens rather late. And a result of this early undifferentiated organ, some very interesting things can happen, especially with respect to environmental perturbations. Sadly, there are many pollutants that actually mimic the action of certain hormones and can have dreadful effects on the development of the reproductive anatomy of fishes. Okay? So that's a very active area of research. I think here's where it gets pretty cool and pretty interesting, is that there are a number of different types of hermaphroditism. I realize that there are a whole bunch of terms for this. This is sort of a traditional term that's used after an intersex Greek god who was the offspring of Hermes and Aphrodite, okay? So rather archaic terminology, but one that you still tend to find in the biological literature. What's kind of interesting is in some cases you may have individuals that are referred to as a synchronous hermaphrodite. And in this case, you would have a mature individual that simultaneously has functioning ovaries and functioning testes, okay? Now, sometimes this simply pops up as a quirk in development in species that normally have males and females. But in other cases, it's actually something that characterizes a species, okay? So there are a couple of different ways this may occur. And at least in theory, it would be possible for a synchronous hermaphrodite to self-fertilize. In some rather rare cases that occurs, but that is pretty doggone rare. Again, painting with rather broad brush strokes. What seems to be a bit more common in these cases, interestingly, is that individuals will assume the role of a male by inseminating another individual that's assuming the role of female, and then can switch roles in order to ultimately reproduce. And then obviously this avoids the problem of, talk about the ultimate in inbreeding depression. If you're self-fertilizing, that's not exactly enhancing genetic diversity, okay? And some examples of that can be found in the Cyprinodontidae, as well as some of the wrasses, which belong to the family Laboridae. And some of you may be familiar with the wrasses. A lot of wrasses are popular aquarium fish, saltwater fish. Okay. What I think is really fascinating is you have some other circumstances where you have consecutive hermaphroditism. This can go two different ways. So again, if you look at the roots of these terms, I think most of you realize that andro refers to male, prot or proto refers to early or first. So protandrous consecutive hermaphrodites are male first, and that's why it's protandrous, and then female. Now here we're actually talking about the same individual, that early in its life it's a male, and then it becomes a female. But the other way can happen. Namely, in some species, they will start off as a female and then become a male. And this really complicated stuff going on is actually quite common within a clade, the Labroidia. Don't worry about that term so much, but there is a clade that includes the parrotfishes and the labrids, the wrasses. And there's a whole lot of that going on here. So it shouldn't be too surprising to you at this stage in the game that even though there may be many species that do something, what they're doing in common might have been something that actually evolved in a recent common ancestor and then was retained. The labrids, the wrasses, are actually very, very diverse. There are many, many species. And there are a reasonable number of species of parrotfish, a little less than 100 species of parrotfish. So we're looking at some stuff that is by no means, massive, massive convergent evolution. We're probably looking at something that popped up in the reproductive physiology and development in the common ancestor, at least in this clade. Now, these things are not limited to this clade, but boy, it's really, really common within this very large clade. So let's just take a look at some pretty pictures of one example of the bicolor parrotfish, a rather blandly colored juvenile that has not yet functionally become female or male. And that juvenile then becomes a reproductive female. So what type is that? Yes. Okay. And then a reproductive male. Okay? And the males are obviously a bit older and actually quite large. And many of them just have these gorgeous, brilliant colors. Yes?
So it's not like they start out with both. It's like you go to this thing and then you go to the next one. Right?
Correct.
Okay.
Because this is consecutive. This is not synchronous. Okay. Now, I think this is where it really gets interesting, is it's not just locked in based on the age of the fish, but there are cues from the social environment that are involved in the change in sex. In many species of parrotfishes, the males have access to many females. They have a harem reproductive strategy, one male, many females. And the male that's doing this is dominant. And if that male kicks the bucket, then the largest female in that male's harem subsequently becomes a male. I just think that's mind-blowing that that social cue has such profound consequences on the reproductive physiology in a man. Really, really cool. Part of the other mix is, look at all these differences in color. I remember when ichthyologists used to believe there were something on the order of about 300 extant species of parrotfish. And I just mentioned to you now the current consensus is something less than 100. And part of the reason for all that confusion is, you go out sampling and maybe you just get one of these at one spot. Maybe you get a juvenile at another spot. You get a female at another spot. And molecular methods have been invaluable for resolving, okay, how many species are there? Obviously, if you have these profound differences in coloration, that can make it seem like there are a lot more that exist. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Is this just where, like, if the male dies, the largest female becomes a male? Is that just in parrotfish, or is that, like, in other?
I know with certainty this happens in parrotfish, okay? I cannot tell you with certainty if a similar thing happens in wrasses, although I do know that wrasses can be consecutive hermaphrodites as well. Okay. But exactly what the cues are where that happens, I can't tell you off the top of my head. Wrasses are so doggone diverse. Again, when you get into these plates with so many species, it's almost anything that can happen does happen. So that's my cop-out, I guess. Okay. You're probably aware that many species of vertebrates have sexual dimorphism that may be manifest in many different traits, anatomical traits. Take a minute or two, and we have 3 individual coho salmon from top to bottom, A, B, and C. Who's a male? Who's a female? Jot that down. From top to bottom. For that top image, who says female? Raise your hands. Higher. Get some exercise. Stretch those muscles. Who says male? So most people are saying male. That second one down. Female? Who says female? Raise your hands. Who says male? Raise your hands. And for that last image, the bottom image, who says male? Who says female? Okay. Well, it's kind of a sneaky thing because there are 2 types of males. There are 2 reproductive strategies in here. If you simply have to guess and you don't have any information about the behavior and ecology of the species within fishes, very often the females are larger than the males. And obviously with a larger body size, in theory, the female could have more eggs, or for a given number of eggs, those eggs could be larger. But there are exceptions to that generalization. For example, when males defend territories, large size is beneficial for agonistic encounters with other males. Generally, bigger is better when it comes to beating up on other males and defending a territory. Furthermore, if you're big and burly, that's beneficial for fighting to gain access to females, okay? Because again, if a bunch of other things are equal, you would expect that a bigger fish is stronger and then would prevail against a smaller fish. But here's where it gets interesting. The big bullies don't always win the day when it comes to reproducing, because in this species and in a number of other species, including the lowly bluejay, there are some males that want to make love, not war, okay? And instead of duking it out for access to females, they simply use stealth to gain access to the females and may not even defend a territory. But when you have all this commotion going on with other big bad males fighting each other, then these little males sort of sneak in and reproduce while these other silly things are going. What's kind of interesting, though, is that this alternative tactic is a frequency, it has a success that is frequency dependent. So, as you get a preponderance of these males that are big and burly fighting it out, then it tends to get easier to have a sneaker male. But if you get too many males doing one thing, then it swings back in favor of the alternative moral. And as it turns out, top one, big burly male, okay, so-called alpha male. So this would be a male that would defend a territory and fight to gain access to females. The female is on the bottom, still a good sized fish, okay? And then the make love not war sneaky male is here, okay? The other thing is, these guys reproduce earlier in their lifetime than these because, it takes another year to get bigger and become an alpha male, okay? What's weird about this fish? This is a phantom anglerfish.
Translucent.
Yeah, that's pretty weird. It's a deep sea fish. So much of those deep sea fish are just weird. If ever you want to see a weird fish.
That's python sword.
Pardon?
I feel like it's like a horn sword.
Yeah, there are all kinds of things in the head end that are weird. Let's not worry about the head end, yeah?
Is that a parasitic male?
Indeed. Okay. How stuff like this evolves, just my mind wants to explode. Stop and think about that. That's the male. It's not simply that the male bites the female and hangs on. Their tissues fuse. He's stuck. As is typical, males are pretty worthless. Doesn't take much to produce sperm. So here's a little sperm producing male, and that's his lot in life once he latches on to a female. I think you would all agree that's a striking example of sexual dimorphism, where you no longer even have a freely moving, swimming male. Okay, basically just a male producing gametes. Again, it's not like this happens all the time, but that's so bizarre, I just couldn't resist. Again, there are all kinds of weird things that happen for the reproduction of fishes, but many of the things involved in courtship and reproduction, I imagine many of you have seen, because at various points in time, probably a lot of you have had tropical fish, or if you've just even walked, through a pet store and sort of observed fish behavior. Again, painting with very broad brush strokes, very often males have brighter colors and larger fins. Why would they?
Hey, pick me.
Pardon me?
It's like a, hey, pick me.
And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Draw more attention.
Okay. Both of those things make them more conspicuous. Okay? And if the reproductive behaviors are such that a male is trying to attract a female, then being conspicuous is a good thing. Okay? And a lot of times, those structures that are larger and more colorful are involved in the behavioral displays, as you can see from the smaller, more brightly colored male guppy displaying courtship behaviors to this more plainly colored and larger female. Okay? But if you're more conspicuous, you're more conspicuous. Now, if you're more conspicuous to the intended receiver, namely a female, that's a good thing. But the problem is those same traits that can make you more conspicuous to a female can make you more conspicuous to a whole bunch of other things, including predators. Okay? Another thing is that actually these incredibly large fins, especially in things like male guppies, are so big and floppy, they impede the ability to perform that escape behavior. So males with these big flashy tails are significantly slower than females. Okay? There have been some incredibly elegant studies of this system for guppies in Trinidad that have demonstrated definitively that these traits can be selected for in these different pools, even within the same stream, such that in the pools where predators exist, you find less flashy males than in pools lacking predators. So again, we're going to have a whole bunch of examples during the semester of, gosh, you know, this specialized anatomy is good for X. But in some cases, what's good for X is bad for Y, okay? And you can get these fascinating trade-offs in these systems where you actually sort of have this back and forth between selection that's involved in survival versus selection that's involved in the reproduction, okay? Those two things can and do not test a lot of time. So let's leave that there for today. We'll just have some stuff next time on reproductive skills. Make sure you sort of reading things ahead of time. Also keep track of, on Friday, you've got a lecture exam and your take-home assignment on fish diversity is due then at the latest, okay?
Next Friday. Next Friday.
Friday this week.
Friday this week. What's your day?
Let me double check the syllabus. Yep, the 17th. First lecture exam and take-home assignment on fish diversity.